The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus Williams adjusted his baseball cap lower, trying to blend into the chaos of the busy grocery store. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this, anyway. As the regional manager for Westfield Markets, he usually announced his visits weeks in advance, giving store managers time to polish everything to perfection. But today was different. Today, he needed to see what really happened when the cameras weren't rolling and the corporate suits weren't watching. The baby formula aisle stretched before him, and Marcus felt that familiar tightness in his chest. 3 years had passed since Sarah died. 3 years since he'd stood in aisles just like this one, desperately reading labels and trying to figure out which brand would make 6-month-old Emma stop crying at 2 in the morning. The memory hit him like it always did. Sudden, sharp, unforgiving. He pushed the shopping cart forward, focusing on the task at hand. This store had been struggling, and he needed to understand why. What he didn't expect was to witness something that would change everything he thought he knew about struggling. Marcus had been conducting these undercover visits for 2 years now, ever since taking over the Western Division. The corporate board loved the idea, a hands-on executive who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. But for Marcus, it was something deeper. After Sarah's death, work had become his refuge, the place where he could control variables and fix problems. Unlike grief, unlike single parenthood, unlike the way Emma sometimes looked at him with Sarah's eyes and asked when Mommy was coming home, the Riverside location had been on his radar for months. Sales were down 18%, customer complaints were up, and the previous manager had quit without notice. On paper, it looked like another failing store in a chain of 300 successful ones. But numbers only told part of the story, and Marcus had learned that the real story usually lived in the spaces between the statistics. He grabbed a package of diapers, size 4, Emma's current size, and made his way toward the front of the store. The lunch rush was in full swing, and he could see the stress etched on every employee's face. Lines snaked back into the aisles, and only 3 registers were open out of 8. He frowned, making mental notes. Understaffing was expensive in the long run, creating customer dissatisfaction and employee burnout. That's when he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 22, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and dark circles under her green eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Her name tag read Rebecca, and she was scanning items with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from muscle memory. But it wasn't her speed that caught Marcus's attention. It was the small cooler bag tucked behind her register, partially hidden from view. As he watched, pretending to study his shopping list, Rebecca glanced around nervously before reaching into the bag. She pulled out a baby bottle, already prepared, and took a quick sip. Not a full drink, just enough to test the temperature. Then she put it back, her movements careful and practiced, like someone who'd done this routine 100 times before. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. He knew that look, that desperate calculation of time and resource. He knew what it meant to skip meals so your child could eat, to make sacrifices that no one else could see or understand. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly this wasn't just another store visit. This was personal. The customer in front of Rebecca, a middle-aged woman with an overflowing cart, was taking her time, questioning every price and demanding to speak to a manager about expired coupons. Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her professional smile, even as Marcus could see her glancing at the clock on her register. 12:47. Her lunch break should have started 17 minutes ago. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't accept this coupon. It expired 3 weeks ago," Rebecca was saying, her voice steady, despite the obvious frustration of the growing line behind the difficult customer. "This is ridiculous," the woman snapped. "I shop here every week, and you people never know what you're doing. Where's your manager?" Marcus watched as Rebecca's composure flickered for just a moment. Her hand moved almost involuntarily toward the hidden cooler bag, and he realized with crystal clarity what was happening. She wasn't just skipping lunch. She was rationing her own break time to feed her baby, probably pumping milk in some cramped break room while gobbling down a granola bar, if she was lucky enough to eat at all. The investigation he had come here to conduct suddenly felt trivial compared to the very real human drama unfolding in front of him. This wasn't about profit margins or customer satisfaction scores. This was about a young mother trying to survive in a system that didn't care about her circumstances, trying to be present for her child while keeping a job that barely paid enough to cover childcare. Marcus made a decision that would have surprised his corporate colleagues. Instead of maintaining his cover, instead of gathering more data for his report, he stepped forward. But not as the regional manager. Not as the man who could fire or hire with a single phone call. He stepped forward as someone who understood exactly what it meant to choose between your own needs and your child's every single day. Rebecca's story was about to intersect with his in ways neither of them could have imagined, and the simple act of witnessing her quiet desperation would force Marcus to confront truths about himself, his company, and the price of putting profits over people. What happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, sacrifice, and what it really meant to take care of the people who made his company run. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but Marcus was no longer listening to their electric drone. He was listening to something else entirely, the sound of a mother doing whatever it took to survive, and the echo of his own memories calling him to act. As Rebecca finally convinced the difficult customer to speak with someone else about her expired coupons, Marcus stepped up to her register with his single package of diapers and a plan that was forming with each passing second. He had no idea that this moment, this choice to see beyond the numbers and into the heart of what mattered, would transform not just Rebecca's life, but his own understanding of what leadership really meant. The baby bottle sat hidden in its cooler bag, waiting. The clock kept ticking toward 1 o'clock. And Marcus Williams, regional manager turned undercover observer, turned reluctant hero, was about to discover that sometimes the most important business decisions have nothing to do with business at all. The next customer in line was checking their phone impatiently, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment settling around him like a heavy coat. In his pocket, his corporate credit card felt suddenly significant, not as a symbol of his authority, but as a tool for something far more important than quarterly reports. He thought of Emma, probably having lunch at daycare right now, surrounded by other children and caring adults who made sure she never went hungry. Not every child was so lucky. Not every mother had the luxury of choice. Marcus stepped forward, his decision made, and prepared to do something that would ripple through the Westfield Markets organization in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The investigation could wait. The reports could wait. What couldn't wait was the chance to prove that sometimes the most profitable thing a company can do is simply care about the people who make it possible. Rebecca looked up at him with tired green eyes, professional smile in place, completely unaware that her life was about to change. "Did you find everything you needed today?" she asked, reaching for his package of diapers. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw himself 3 years ago, overwhelmed and trying to figure out how to be enough for a child who needed everything. "Actually," he said, his voice gentler than his usual corporate tone, "I think I'm just getting started." The wheels were already turning in his mind, but first he needed to understand her story. And then, if he was reading the situation correctly, he needed to figure out how to help without destroying her pride in the process. Because he knew better than anyone that sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones least likely to ask for it. The baby bottle waited in its cooler bag, a silent testament to the lengths a mother would go to care for her child. The clock ticked past 1 o'clock, marking another missed lunch break in what Marcus suspected was a long series of sacrifices. And in the fluorescent-lit chaos of a struggling grocery store, 2 single parents were about to discover that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. What Rebecca didn't know was that the man standing in front of her register, asking about diapers with the careful attention of someone who'd been there before, wasn't just another customer. He was someone who understood her situation better than she could imagine, someone with the power to change her circumstances, and someone who was about to learn that real leadership had nothing to do with corner offices and everything to do with recognizing the quiet heroism of everyday survival. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but their conversation was just beginning. Marcus picked up this package of diapers, studying the label as if he were genuinely comparing brands, but his real attention was focused on Rebecca. The way she kept glancing at the clock, the careful positioning of the cooler bag, the practiced efficiency that spoke of someone who'd learned to maximize every minute of every break. "These are good diapers," he said conversationally, tapping the package. "My daughter's 3 now, but I remember when every decision felt huge. Formula, diapers, which bottle would work best?" He paused, watching her reaction. "How old is yours?" Rebecca's professional smile flickered into something more genuine, though wariness crept into her eyes. Customers didn't usually ask personal questions, and she'd learned to be careful about sharing too much. 8 months, she said quietly, then caught herself. "I mean, if you have any questions about baby products, I can call someone from that department." "No need," Marcus said, his voice warm. 8 months is a great age. They're starting to show their personalities, but they still need you for everything. He gestured toward the cooler bar, making his observation seem casual. "Smart thinking, keeping everything organized for your breaks." The color that rose in Rebecca's cheeks told him everything he needed to know. She was embarrassed, probably worried that he'd noticed she was prioritizing her baby's needs over store policy. Her hand moved protectively toward the bag, a gesture so instinctive it made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. "It's just," she started, then stopped, clearly unsure how much to explain to a stranger. "Just what any good mother would do," Marcus finished gently. "I get it. Really." The customer behind him cleared their throat impatiently, and Rebecca's attention snapped back to the transaction. Her movements became more efficient, more professional, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. She was caught between worlds, the mother who needed to pump milk for her baby, and the employee who couldn't afford to lose this job. "That'll be $12.97, she said, her voice steady despite everything. Marcus handed her a 20, studying her face as she made change. The dark circles under her eyes weren't just from normal, new parent exhaustion. This was deeper, the bone-deep weariness of someone carrying too much weight alone. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough to recognize it. "Keep the change," he said, when she tried to hand him $7.03. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Sir, I can't—" "Sure you can," Marcus said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Consider it a tip for excellent customer service." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "And for being the kind of mother who puts her child first, even when it's hard." For a moment, Rebecca's professional composure cracked entirely. Her eyes filled with tears, she blinked back quickly, and Marcus saw her swallow hard before she managed to speak. "Thank you," she whispered, and he could hear everything she wasn't saying in those 2 words. The gratitude wasn't just for the tip, it was for being seen, for being recognized as someone doing her best in an impossible situation. Marcus knew that feeling too, the exhaustion of being strong all the time, of making everything work when the pieces didn't fit together properly. "What's your baby's name?" he asked, ignoring the increasingly impatient line behind him. "Lily," Rebecca said, and her whole face softened when she said it. "Her name's Lily." "That's beautiful," Marcus said, and meant it. "I bet she's lucky to have you." Rebecca's laugh was shaky. "Some days I'm not so sure about that." "Trust me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of his own experience. "She is." The customer behind him made an exaggerated sighing sound, but Marcus didn't care. This conversation was more important than anyone else's schedule, including his own. He was beginning to understand that his undercover investigation had led him to something far more significant than he'd planned. "Listen," he said, leaning slightly closer to the register. "I know this might sound strange, but would you be willing to talk sometime? Maybe grab coffee? I think we might have more in common than you'd expect." Rebecca's wariness returned full force. She'd probably had enough experience with men who thought a friendly conversation was an invitation for something more. "I don't know," she said carefully. "I mean, I don't really have time for— I'm a single dad," Marcus said quickly, understanding her hesitation. "My daughter Emma is 3. I'm not— This isn't what you think it is. I just think maybe we could help each other figure some things out." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because her posture relaxed slightly. "You really have a daughter?" "Emma Rose Williams," Marcus said, pulling out his phone and showing her a picture. "She's at daycare right now, probably having goldfish crackers and apple slices for lunch." Rebecca studied the photo, Emma grinning at the camera with chocolate on her face and pigtails askew, and her smile became genuine for the first time. "She's beautiful," she said. "She looks like trouble." "Oh, she is," Marcus laughed. "The best kind of trouble." The line behind him was getting longer, and Marcus could see Rebecca's supervisor glancing their way with increasing frequency. He needed to wrap this up before she got in trouble for talking too long with a customer. "Look, I know you need to get back to work," he said. "But if you ever want to talk to someone who understands what it's like to do this alone, here's my card." He pulled out one of his generic business cards, the ones that just had his name and phone number, without any mention of Westfield Markets or his corporate title. Rebecca took the card hesitantly, studying it. "Marcus Williams," she read aloud. "That's me," he said. "And Rebecca?" "Johnson," she supplied. "Rebecca Johnson," he repeated. "It was really good to meet you, Rebecca. And remember what I said about Lily being lucky." As he walked away, Marcus could feel the weight of what he'd just committed to. He had no clear plan, no corporate protocol for this situation. All he knew was that he'd recognized something in Rebecca that resonated with his own struggles, and he couldn't walk away without trying to help. But help how, and without compromising her independence or his own position? These were questions he'd need to answer soon, because he had a feeling Rebecca Johnson was about to become much more than just another employee in his investigation report. Behind him, he could hear Rebecca's voice returning to its professional cadence as she helped the next customer. But he'd seen the real person underneath that facade now, and he knew she'd be impossible to forget. The investigation could wait. The reports could wait. What couldn't wait was figuring out how to use his position to make a real difference in the life of someone who desperately needed it, without destroying her dignity in the process. Marcus Williams, regional manager turned undercover observer turned reluctant hero, walked out of the store with more questions than answers. But for the first time in months, those questions felt like they mattered more than any quarterly profit report ever could. 3 days passed before Rebecca called. Marcus was in his office, reviewing quarterly reports that felt increasingly meaningless, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Marcus, this is Rebecca, from the store." Her voice was hesitant, like she wasn't sure this was a good idea. "Rebecca, hi," Marcus said, closing the reports and giving her his full attention. "I'm glad you called. I was wondering if that coffee offer was still open. I know it's probably weird, calling a customer, but I've been thinking about what you said and—" She trailed off, then started again. "I could use someone to talk to who gets it." "Absolutely," Marcus said. "When works for you?" "I get off at 6 today. There's a coffee shop called Brew Haven about 2 blocks from the store. Would 7 work? Perfect. I'll see you there. After hanging up, Marcus stared at his phone for a long moment. He was walking into uncharted territory, balancing his corporate responsibility with something that felt far more personal and important. But Emma's daycare picture smiled at him from his desk, and he thought about all the times he'd wished someone understood what it was like to carry so much responsibility alone. Brew Haven was exactly the kind of place Marcus had expected. Cozy, slightly worn, with mismatched furniture and the comfortable buzz of conversation. He arrived early and chose a corner table, ordering a black coffee and trying to figure out exactly what he was doing. Rebecca appeared at 7 sharp, looking different in jeans and a sweater instead of her uniform. She still looked tired, but there was something more relaxed about her posture. She ordered a decaf latte and slid into the seat across from him. "I almost didn't come," she said without preamble. "What changed your mind?" Rebecca wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Lily had a rough night last night. Teething, I think. I was walking around the apartment at 3 in the morning, trying to get her to stop crying, and I kept thinking about what you said, about understanding what it's like to do this alone." Marcus nodded. "I remember those nights. Emma went through a phase where she'd only sleep if I held her and walked in circles around the living room. I probably logged 50 miles some weeks. Did you ever feel like you were failing? Like everyone else had figured out this parenting thing except you?" The question hit Marcus squarely in the chest. "Every single day," he said honestly, "especially in the beginning. Sarah, Emma's mom, she died when Emma was 6 months old. Suddenly I was responsible for this tiny person who needed everything, and I had no idea what I was doing." Rebecca's expression softened. "I'm sorry. That must have been horrible." "It was," Marcus said simply. "But you find a way to keep going, because you have to, just like you're doing." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own memories. Then Rebecca spoke again, her voice quieter. "Lily's father left when I was 5 months pregnant. Said he wasn't ready to be a dad, like it was something you could just opt out of." She laughed bitterly. "I thought about giving her up for adoption. Spent weeks researching families, thinking maybe she'd be better off with people who had their lives together." "What changed your mind?" "The first time I felt her kick, really felt it, not just those little flutters. She kicked so hard it actually hurt, and I just started crying, because I realized she was already mine, already part of me. And I couldn't imagine anyone else raising her, even if they could give her things I couldn't." Marcus understood completely. "Love doesn't require a perfect situation," he said. "Just a willing heart." "Is that from something?" "My mother used to say it. I didn't understand what she meant until Emma came along." Rebecca studied his face. "You seem like you have it all figured out now, though. You're confident, successful." Marcus almost choked on his coffee. If only she knew about the corporate credit cards in his wallet, the corner office, the salary that made his struggles feel like luxury problems compared to hers. But he wasn't ready to reveal that yet, not when she was finally opening up. "Trust me, I'm making it up as I go along, just like everyone else," he said instead. "The only difference is practice. How do you manage work and everything? I feel like I'm constantly choosing between being a good employee and being a good mother." This was dangerous territory. Marcus thought about the flexible schedule his position afforded him, the company daycare, the nanny he could afford when Emma was sick. All advantages Rebecca couldn't even imagine. "It's hard," he said carefully. "I'm lucky to have a job with some flexibility, but there are still days when I feel like I'm dropping balls everywhere. The other day, my supervisor wrote me up for taking too long on my lunch break," Rebecca said, anger creeping into her voice. "I was pumping milk for Lily, and the machine broke. I had to hand express everything, which takes forever. But when I tried to explain, she just said personal issues couldn't interfere with work performance. Marcus felt his jaw clench. He made a mental note to have a conversation with that supervisor, carefully, without revealing his connection to Rebecca. "That's not right," he said. "Pumping milk isn't a personal issue. It's a medical necessity." "Try explaining that to corporate," Rebecca said bitterly. "They act like having a baby is a choice that shouldn't affect anything else in your life." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He was corporate, at least for the company where she worked. And right now, he was learning more about employee relations than any report could have taught him. "What would make it easier?" he asked. "If you could change anything about your situation, what would it be?" Rebecca was quiet for a long time, considering. "A break room that actually had a comfortable chair and a mini-fridge that worked," she said finally. "Maybe shifts that didn't change every week so I could plan childcare better, and managers who understood that sometimes life happens and it doesn't mean you don't care about your job." Simple things, reasonable things, changes that would cost the company almost nothing but would make an enormous difference for employees like Rebecca. "Those don't sound like impossible requests," Marcus said. "They might as well be. You know how many people apply for every job opening at the store. They don't have to accommodate anyone. If I complain too much, they'll just find someone who won't." Marcus thought about the turnover rates in his reports, the exit interviews that cited lack of support for working parents. He'd always seen them as numbers, statistics to be improved. He'd never connected them to real people making impossible choices. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said, interrupting his thoughts. "Of course. What do you do for work? You said you have flexibility and you seem, I don't know, like you're used to solving problems." Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was the moment he'd been dreading. "I work in management," he said, which was technically true. "Business operations." "That's pretty vague," Rebecca said with a small smile. "Are you some kind of consultant or something?" "Something like that," Marcus said, hating himself for the half-truth. But what was he supposed to say? That he was her ultimate boss, the person who could actually fix all the problems she'd just described, but had chosen to approach her as a fellow struggling parent instead? Rebecca seemed to accept his non-answer, but Marcus could see her filing it away. She wasn't stupid, and his evasiveness was probably raising questions. "I should get going," she said, glancing at her phone. "Lily's with my neighbor, but she'll want to eat soon." "Of course," Marcus said, standing as she gathered her things. "I'm glad you called, Rebecca. This was really good." "Yeah, it was," she said, and seemed surprised by her own admission. "Maybe we could do it again sometime." "I'd like that." They walked out together, and Marcus watched her head toward an old Honda Civic that had seen better days. She waved before getting in, and he found himself standing on the sidewalk long after her tail lights disappeared, thinking about everything she'd told him. The next morning, Marcus called an emergency meeting with the Riverside store management team. He didn't mention Rebecca by name, but he made it clear that policies regarding nursing mothers needed to be reviewed immediately. He also ordered an audit of the break room facilities and requested a report on scheduling practices that might be affecting employees with children. His assistant raised an eyebrow at the sudden interest in employee welfare, but Marcus just said he'd been reviewing customer feedback about staff turnover. Which was true, in a way. But even as he threw his corporate weight around to make changes, Marcus knew he was walking a tightrope. Every improvement he made for Rebecca would help other employees too, but he was essentially using insider information to benefit someone he'd befriended under false pretenses. The ethical implications kept him awake that night, staring at the ceiling while Emma slept peacefully down the hall. He'd started this as a simple undercover investigation and somehow ended up in the most complicated situation of his professional life. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Thank you for listening tonight. It felt good to talk to someone who understands." Marcus stared at the message for a long time before responding, "Anytime. That's what friends are for." But as he hit send, he wondered how long he could maintain this friendship built on a foundation of secrets. And what would happen when Rebecca inevitably discovered who he really was? The changes at the Riverside store began the following week. A new pumping room was installed in the break area, complete with a comfortable chair, mini-fridge, and locking door. The employee scheduling system was overhauled to provide more consistency and advance notice, and Marcus made it very clear to management that supporting working parents wasn't just good policy, it was a business imperative. Rebecca texted him about the changes, her excitement evident even through the screen. "You won't believe what happened at work today. They actually installed a proper lactation room. I almost cried when I saw it." Marcus smiled as he read her message, feeling a satisfaction deeper than any quarterly profit report had ever provided. But mixed with that satisfaction was a growing dread. The improvements were happening too quickly, too specifically targeted to her complaints. If Rebecca was as smart as he thought she was, she'd start connecting dots soon. "That's amazing." He texted back. "Sounds like someone finally listened. I keep wondering who complained and got them to actually do something. None of us thought they cared enough to make changes like this." Marcus stared at his phone, his finger hovering over the keyboard. This was his chance to come clean, to tell her the truth about who he was and how he'd been able to help. But something held him back. Maybe cowardice, maybe the fear of seeing disappointment replace the growing trust in her eyes. Maybe they just realized it was the right thing to do. He typed instead. 2 weeks later, they met for coffee again. Rebecca looked different, more rested, more relaxed. The improvements at work were clearly making a difference, and Marcus felt the complicated satisfaction of seeing his influence create positive change. "I still can't believe how much better things are," Rebecca said, settling into what had become their usual corner table. "The new pumping room is amazing, and they've actually been consistent with my schedule. It's like someone waved a magic wand." "You deserve to be treated well," Marcus said. "All employees do." Rebecca studied his face. "You know, you never really told me what kind of management work you do." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the changes at my store started right after we talked about those problems. And you have this way of talking about employee issues like you've dealt with them professionally." She leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, are you involved with corporate somehow?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Marcus wasn't ready to face. He could see the wheels turning in Rebecca's mind, putting together pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. "Why would you think that?" he asked, buying time. "Because I'm not stupid," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a new edge. "And because, when I really think about it, what are the chances that a random customer who happens to be a single dad would show up at my register the same week all these miraculous improvements start happening?" Marcus felt the careful house of cards he'd built starting to collapse. Rebecca was staring at him with a mixture of suspicion and something that might have been betrayal, and he realized that his attempt to help without revealing himself had backfired spectacularly. "Rebecca, I can explain. Who are you really?" she interrupted. "And please don't insult my intelligence with another vague answer about business operations." The moment of truth had arrived, whether Marcus was ready for it or not. Everything he'd built with Rebecca, the trust, the friendship, the mutual understanding, hung in the balance. And he had no idea if telling her the truth would save it or destroy it completely. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too public for the conversation they were about to have. Marcus looked at Rebecca's face, saw the hurt beneath the anger, and knew that whatever happened next would change everything between them. "You're right," he said quietly. "I haven't been completely honest with you." Rebecca's expression didn't change, but he could see her bracing herself for impact. "My name is Marcus Williams, and I am a single father, and everything I told you about Emma and my struggles, that's all true." He took a deep breath. "But I'm also the regional manager for Westfield Markets. I was at your store that day conducting an undercover evaluation." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca stared at him as if he'd just revealed he was an alien from another planet. Her hands tightened around her coffee cup until her knuckles went white. "You're my boss," she said finally, her voice flat. "Technically, yes. But Rebecca, that's not why I—" "Oh my God!" She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Oh my God. I told you everything. About my supervisor writing me up, about struggling to make ends meet, about Lily's father." Her voice cracked. "I trusted you. You can still trust me," Marcus said desperately, also standing. "Nothing you told me will be used against you, I swear." "How can I believe that?" Rebecca's voice was rising, drawing stares from other customers. "You've been lying to me for weeks. You let me think you were just some random guy who understood what I was going through, when the whole time you were evaluating me like some kind of corporate spy." "That's not what happened," Marcus said, his own voice urgent. "Yes, I was there for an evaluation. But the moment I saw you with that bottle, the moment I realized what you were going through, everything changed. I wasn't evaluating you anymore. I was seeing you. And you didn't think I deserved to know who you were. You didn't think I had the right to decide whether I wanted to confide in my boss about my personal problems." Marcus felt the full weight of his deception crashing down on him. She was right, completely right, and he had no defense except his own good intentions, which felt pathetically inadequate in the face of her justified anger. "I should have told you," he admitted. "I know that. I was just afraid that if you knew who I was, you'd never let me help you. You'd never trust me enough to tell me what you really needed. So you decided to trick me instead." Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "How very corporate of you. Manipulate people for their own good because you know better than they do what's best for them." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow because it contained more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. "That's not what I was trying to do, isn't it? You gathered information about my problems, then used your position to fix them without my knowledge or consent. You made me grateful for changes you could have implemented at any time, but chose to wait until you had a personal stake in the outcome." Marcus stood there, watching the trust he'd carefully built crumble before his eyes. Everything Rebecca was saying was accurate, and yet it felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of his motivations. But how could he explain the complexity of what he'd felt without sounding like he was making excuses? "I know how this looks," he said quietly, "but I need you to understand. Meeting you changed everything for me. It wasn't about the evaluation anymore. It was about connecting with someone who understood what I go through every day." "And you couldn't have done that honestly?" Rebecca's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You couldn't have just introduced yourself as who you actually are and let me make my own choices?" "Would you have?" Marcus asked. "If I'd walked up to your register and said, 'Hi, I'm the regional manager, and I'd like to buy you coffee so we can talk about your struggles as a single mother,' would you have said yes?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, and Marcus could see her considering the question seriously. "I don't know," she said finally. "But that should have been my choice to make." She was absolutely right, and Marcus knew it. In trying to protect her from the power imbalance between them, he'd created an even bigger breach of trust. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I handled this completely wrong." Rebecca gathered her purse and jacket, her movements sharp with anger and hurt. "I need to think about this," she said. "About what it means, about whether I can still work there, knowing you've been watching and evaluating everything I do." Please don't quit, Marcus said quickly. Your job is secure, regardless of anything that's happened between us personally, and all the changes we made. They're permanent, for you and every other employee. How generous, Rebecca said, her tone cutting. You get to play hero, and I get to feel like a charity case. That's not. Goodbye, Marcus, she said, cutting him off. Or should I say Mr. Williams? Marcus watched her walk away, feeling like he'd just lost something infinitely more valuable than any business relationship. The coffee shop suddenly felt cold and empty, filled with the ghost of conversations that might never happen again. He'd tried to help someone he cared about, but in his arrogance he'd assumed he knew the best way to do it. He'd treated Rebecca like a problem to be solved, rather than a person with her own agency and dignity. And now he was facing the consequences of playing God with someone else's life, no matter how good his intentions had been. The worst part was that he understood her anger completely. If their positions had been reversed, if she'd deceived him while he poured out his struggles, he would have felt exactly the same way. Marcus sat back down heavily, staring at the coffee cup Rebecca had left behind. The relationship they'd built was probably irreparable, but maybe he could still find a way to prove that his actions, however misguided, had come from a place of genuine care rather than corporate manipulation. The question was whether Rebecca would ever be willing to give him the chance to try. The next few days passed in a blur of corporate meetings and reports, but Marcus found his attention constantly drifting to Rebecca. He didn't contact her. She'd made it clear she needed space, but he found himself worrying about how their confrontation might be affecting her work environment. On Friday, he made an unannounced visit to the Riverside store, this time wearing his corporate credentials openly. He wanted to ensure that Rebecca wasn't facing any negative consequences from their personal interaction, and to make it clear to the entire staff that the recent improvements were permanent policy changes, not temporary measures. He spotted Rebecca immediately, working at her usual register. She saw him too, and he watched her shoulders tense as he approached. But instead of going to her line, he headed straight to the manager's office. 20 minutes later, he emerged having delivered clear instructions about maintaining the new policies and supporting all employees with work-life balance needs. As he walked through the store, he deliberately avoided Rebecca's section, but he could feel her watching him. Near the exit, he paused at a bulletin board where employee notices were posted. Taking out a pen, he wrote a brief note on company letterhead and pinned it prominently. The recent improvements to our family support policies reflect our ongoing commitment to all employees. These changes are permanent and part of our company-wide initiative to create better working conditions for parents and caregivers. Questions or concerns should be directed to regional management. Marcus Williams, regional manager. It wasn't much, but it was his way of making a public statement that Rebecca's job security wasn't tied to their personal relationship, and that the improvements she'd benefited from were now official policy that couldn't be reversed on a whim. As he left the store, Marcus caught a glimpse of Rebecca reading the notice. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and he thought he saw something in her expression soften slightly. But she looked away quickly, and Marcus continued to his car, wondering if he'd ever get the chance to rebuild what he'd lost through his own poor judgment. That night, as he tucked Emma into bed, his daughter looked up at him with the serious expression she sometimes wore when she was thinking hard about something. "Daddy, why do you look sad?" she asked. Marcus smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt people they care about," he said, "and then they feel sad about it." "Did you say sorry?" "I tried to, sweetheart, but sometimes sorry isn't enough." Emma considered this with the gravity only a 3-year-old could bring to philosophical questions. "Maybe you need to try harder," she said finally. Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus thought. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe he needed to find a better way to show Rebecca that his feelings for her, and his regret over deceiving her were genuine. The answer came from an unexpected source 2 weeks later. Marcus was reviewing employee feedback surveys when he noticed a pattern in the responses from the Riverside location. Multiple employees mentioned feeling more supported and valued since the recent policy changes, but what caught his attention was a comment from an anonymous respondent. "Someone finally listened to what we actually need instead of what they think we need. More of this, please." The words hit Marcus like a revelation. Someone finally listened. That was what he'd failed to do with Rebecca, really listen without an agenda, without trying to fix things his way. That evening, he sat down and wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter on his personal stationery, not corporate letterhead. He wrote and rewrote it 3 times before he was satisfied. The next day, he drove to the Riverside store one more time, but instead of going inside, he left the letter with the flowers. Simple daisies, not roses, nothing that could be misinterpreted as romantic, at the customer service desk with instructions to give them to Rebecca Johnson at the end of her shift. Rebecca found the letter that evening when she got home from work. Lily was finally asleep after a particularly fussy bedtime routine, and Rebecca was exhausted. The sight of the envelope with her name written in unfamiliar handwriting made her frown. She almost threw it away unopened, assuming it was some kind of corporate follow-up to Marcus's deception. But something about the careful handwriting, the way her name was written with obvious thought and care, made her pause. Against her better judgment, she opened it. "Dear Rebecca," it began. "I've started this letter a dozen times, trying to find the right words to explain what happened and why. But every time I try to justify my actions, I realize that there is no justification for the way I handled things. You were right about everything you said in the coffee shop. I did manipulate the situation. I did deny you the choice to make your own decisions about our relationship, and I did treat you like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. The truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you'd never let me get to know the real you. I was afraid you'd put up walls and give me corporate-approved answers instead of sharing your real struggles. But what I failed to understand is that those walls would have been your right to build, and breaking them down through deception was a violation of your trust and your autonomy. I want you to know that everything I told you about my own life was true. Emma is real. My struggles as a single father are real, and my connection to you as someone who understands those struggles was real. But I also need to acknowledge that I came into your life from a position of privilege and power that I completely failed to recognize or address appropriately. You asked me once what would make things easier for working parents at the store. The changes we implemented were based on your answers to that question, but I realize now that I robbed you of the satisfaction of knowing that your voice was heard and your suggestions were valued. Instead, I made you feel like a recipient of charity rather than a contributor to positive change. I can't undo the deception, but I want you to know that those changes are permanent company-wide policy now. Every Westfield Markets location is implementing the same family support measures, and they're being credited to employee feedback and advocacy. Your voice is being heard, even if you don't get the recognition you deserve for it. I also want you to know that I understand if you never want to speak to me again. I violated your trust in a fundamental way, and trust, once broken, doesn't automatically repair itself just because the person who broke it is sorry. But if you're ever willing to give me another chance, not as your boss, not as someone trying to help you, but as someone who genuinely values your friendship and wants to earn back your trust, I'll be here. No hidden agendas, no corporate authority, just one single parent talking to another. You can reach me at my personal number if you decide you want to talk. Or not. The choice is entirely yours, as it should have been from the beginning. With sincere apologies and respect. Marcus. Emma asked me why I looked sad lately, and when I explained that I'd hurt someone I cared about, She said I should try harder to make it right. I'm not sure what trying harder looks like yet, but I wanted you to know that even a 3-year-old understands the importance of genuine effort when you've wronged someone. Rebecca read the letter twice, then set it down on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now, a grudging respect for the honesty of his apology. She thought about the changes at work, about the lactation room that had made such a difference in her daily life, about the consistent schedule that allowed her to plan better care for Lily. She thought about the other employees who had benefited from the same improvements, mothers and fathers she worked alongside who were struggling with their own challenges. Marcus had lied to her about who he was, but the help he'd provided was real. The improvements were real, and according to his letter, they were now helping other parents at other stores too. Rebecca got up and poured herself a glass of wine, then sat back down with the letter. She found herself remembering their conversations, the way Marcus had listened to her struggles without judgment, the way he'd shared his own vulnerabilities. Had that been real, or just part of an elaborate manipulation? Reading the letter again, she found herself believing it had been real. The corporate executive who could implement policy changes with a phone call was one person, but the man who understood what it felt like to walk the floor at 3 a.m. with a crying baby was someone else entirely. Maybe both could be true at the same time. 3 days later, Rebecca picked up her phone and dialed Marcus's personal number. Her heart was beating fast, and she almost hung up when she heard his voice. "Marcus? It's Rebecca." There was a pause, and she could hear the surprise in his voice when he responded. "Rebecca, hi. Thank you for calling." "I got your letter," she said. "And the flowers. They were beautiful. I'm glad you liked them, though I wasn't sure you'd read the letter at all." "I almost didn't," Rebecca admitted. "But I'm glad I did. It was honest, more honest than you were when we first met. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything," Marcus said carefully. "But would you be willing to meet again? I promise, no more secrets, no more corporate authority hanging over the conversation, just 2 people talking." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, considering. "I need you to understand something first," she said finally. "I can't pretend the power imbalance doesn't exist. You are still my boss, technically, and that affects everything between us." "I know," Marcus said. "And I've been thinking about that too. What if it didn't have to?" "What do you mean?" "What if there was a way for us to have a friendship that wasn't complicated by corporate hierarchy? What if you didn't work for my company anymore?" Rebecca felt her stomach drop. "Are you firing me?" "No, God, no," Marcus said quickly. "I'm talking about something else entirely, but I don't want to discuss it over the phone. Would you be willing to meet with me one more time? I have an idea, but I want to run it by you in person." Against her better judgment, Rebecca found herself agreeing. They arranged to meet at a different coffee shop, one across town from their usual place, and Rebecca spent the intervening days wondering what Marcus could possibly have in mind. When she arrived at the new coffee shop, Marcus was already there, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. He stood when he saw her, and Rebecca was struck by how different he seemed when she knew who he really was. The confidence was still there, but it was tempered by something that looked like humility. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm not sure why I did," Rebecca said honestly. "But I'm here." Marcus nodded, seeming to gather his courage. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation. About trust, about power dynamics, about what it means to really help someone." "Okay," Rebecca said, waiting. "I want to offer you a job," Marcus said. "Not at Westfield Markets, but with a consulting firm that specializes in workplace culture and employee advocacy." They're looking for someone with first-hand experience in retail who can help companies understand what working parents actually need. Rebecca stared at him. You want to give me a job? I want to recommend you for a job where your insights and experiences would be valued, where you'd be helping to create the kind of changes that matter to working families. The pay is better than what you're making now, the benefits are excellent, and the schedule is much more flexible. And what's the catch? Rebecca asked, her tone wary. No catch, Marcus said. Well, except that it would mean you wouldn't work for my company anymore, which would eliminate the power imbalance between us. Rebecca felt a mix of emotions, surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. Why would you do this? Because you're smart, because you understand these issues better than most people in corporate America, and because you deserve a chance to use your insights to help other people. Marcus paused. And because, if we're going to have any kind of relationship, friendship or otherwise, it needs to be between equals. You're trying to solve my problems again, Rebecca said, but there was less anger in her voice than there might have been before. Maybe, Marcus admitted. But this time I'm asking first instead of making decisions for you. The job offer is real, and it's yours if you want it. But if you'd rather stay where you are, that's fine too. Either way, I'd like the chance to be your friend. The real kind of friend, built on honesty instead of deception. Rebecca sat back in her chair, trying to process what he was offering. A better job? A way out of the retail grind? A chance to turn her struggles into something that could help other people? It sounded too good to be true. Tell me about this job, she said finally. For the next hour, Marcus explained the position in detail. The consulting firm was legitimate, the role was real, and the opportunity was genuine. He'd made the connection, but the interview process would be entirely separate from his influence. I'd have to prove myself, Rebecca said, thinking through the implications. You'd have to show them what I already know, that you're exactly what they're looking for, Marcus corrected. As they talked, Rebecca found herself remembering why she'd been drawn to Marcus in the first place. Underneath the corporate executive was someone who genuinely cared about making things better for people. The deception had been wrong, but the intentions behind it were becoming clearer. If I take this job, she said slowly, and if we try to be friends, how do I know you won't try to manage my life again? You don't, Marcus said honestly. But I can promise to be transparent about my motivations, and I can promise to ask before I act. And you can promise to call me out when I forget that you're perfectly capable of managing your own life. Despite everything, Rebecca found herself smiling. That might be a full-time job in itself. Probably, Marcus agreed. But I'm a quick learner when properly motivated. They talked for another hour about the job opportunity, about trust, about what it might look like to build a real friendship on a foundation of honesty instead of deception. When they finally said goodbye, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope for a future that held more possibilities than just surviving from paycheck to paycheck. 2 weeks later, Rebecca interviewed for the consulting position and was offered the job on the spot. Her insights into the challenges facing working parents were exactly what the firm needed, and her ability to articulate practical solutions impressed everyone she met. On her last day at Westfield Markets, several of her co-workers thanked her for the improvements that had been made. They assumed she'd been part of the employee advocacy that led to the changes, and Rebecca didn't correct them. In a way, it was true. Her voice had been heard, even if the path between speaking and being heard had been more complicated than anyone realized. Marcus came to the store that day, officially to wish her well in her new position. Unofficially, to see if the tentative friendship they'd been rebuilding could survive the transition. Any regrets? he asked as they stood in the parking lot after her shift ended. About the job? No, Rebecca said. About giving you another chance? Ask me in 6 months. Marcus laughed. Fair enough, but I'm optimistic. Why? Because you're here talking to me instead of walking away, and because Emma's going to love having another single parent in our lives who understands what it's like. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Who says I'm going to meet Emma? Give it time, Marcus said confidently. She's been asking about the friend who taught Daddy about trying harder to make things right. Despite herself, Rebecca smiled. You told a 3-year-old about our situation? In age-appropriate terms, Marcus said. She's very wise for her age. I think you'd like her. I probably would, Rebecca admitted. As she drove away that evening, Rebecca found herself thinking about fresh starts and second chances. The consulting job was an opportunity to turn her struggles into something meaningful, to help other working parents navigate the challenges she knew so well. And Marcus, complicated, flawed, well-intentioned Marcus, had proven that people could change, that mistakes could be acknowledged and growth was possible. It wasn't the ending she'd expected when she first met him at her register, but it was something potentially better. A beginning built on truth instead of deception, respect instead of manipulation, and the possibility that 2 people who'd both made mistakes could find a way forward together. 6 months later, Rebecca was thriving in her new role, helping companies across the country implement family-friendly policies that made real differences in employees' lives. She and Marcus had developed a genuine friendship, built slowly and carefully on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. Emma and Lily had become fast friends during carefully orchestrated playdates, and watching their children together reminded both adults of what was possible when people chose connection over isolation, trust over suspicion. The consulting work was fulfilling in ways Rebecca had never imagined possible. Every policy change she helped implement, every company culture she helped shift toward supporting working parents, felt like a victory, not just for other families, but for the woman she'd been 6 months ago, struggling alone at a register, skipping lunch to feed her baby, convinced that no one in authority cared about her struggles. Marcus had learned to step back and let Rebecca lead their friendship, to ask instead of assume, to support instead of trying to solve. It was a work in progress, but it was progress nonetheless. One evening, as they watched Emma and Lily play together in Marcus's backyard, Rebecca found herself thinking about how different her life had become. The financial stress was largely gone, the work was meaningful, and for the first time since Lily was born, she felt like she was building something instead of just surviving. Penny for your thoughts, Marcus said, settling into the lawn chair beside her. Just thinking about how things change, Rebecca said. 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what my life was going to look like. Limited options, constant stress, no way out. And now I'm helping other people find their way out of situations like mine. She paused, searching for the right words. It's like taking something painful and making it useful, Marcus nodded. That's what the best kinds of change feel like. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughters play. The evening air was warm, filled with the sound of children's laughter and the distant hum of suburban life. Marcus? Rebecca said eventually. Yeah? Thank you. For the opportunity, for the honesty, for learning how to be a real friend instead of just someone trying to help. Thank you for giving me the chance to try harder, Marcus replied, echoing his daughter's earlier wisdom. And for teaching me that the best way to help someone is to listen to what they actually need. As the sun set over the backyard, where 2 single parents had found friendship and 2 little girls had found each other, it felt like the ending of one story and the beginning of another. Not a fairy tale where everything was magically perfect, but something better, A real story about real people learning to trust, to grow, and to build something meaningful together. The fluorescent lights of that grocery store felt like a lifetime ago, but the lessons learned there would last forever. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen in the most ordinary places, and sometimes the people who need each other most find each other in the most unexpected ways. Marcus Williams, single father and corporate executive, had learned that true leadership meant creating space for others to succeed. Rebecca Johnson, single mother and survivor, had learned that accepting help didn't mean giving up independence. And Emma and Lily, oblivious to the complicated adult world that had brought their families together, had learned that friendship was simple. You find someone who makes you laugh, you share your toys, and you stick together when things get scary. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all.